Hey, Rob, thanks for so much for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I know we were just complaining a little bit about the weather out here, but we also can't complain too much out here in Scottsdale. But hopefully it starts to cool down a little bit.
Yes, for sure. I'm ready.
Can you tell us a little bit about your origin story and kind of the evolution from early in your career, the fields of psychology, to now really focusing more what appears to be the fields of human movement, coaching, and perception?
So I am from Canada originally, from Toronto. I did all my education there, grad school, and I kind of focused on my degrees are in psychology, experimental psychology, and I always had a kind of interest in applying, so not doing lab work, more kind of addressing real world issues. And I started out in my career, I kind of started out kind of broadly as a performance scientist. So I did a little bit of sports, but I also studied a lot of research on driving and aviation because it's easier to get funding for those, to be honest, than sports research. And I kept kind of growing and growing. And then I kind of, as I got further on in my career, I was able to kind of get more freedom to do what I really wanted to do. I'd study sports. Basically, I started studying visual perception in sports. That's where I got my background. And then eventually slowly moved into studying skill acquisition. What's the best way to acquire skills, motor learning. And so I've done that. And then as a last, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, I've kind of got the opportunity to do more kind of consulting and working with teams and organizations. Being in Arizona, working with Major League Baseball teams, half of them are here. So that's been good in a lot of different sports. So I've kind of evolved into I'm really focusing on that aspect of it.
You mentioned three words that I really just want to jump right in and set the stage to kind of define some of the other parts of the conversation. And those three words you said were motor skill acquisition in its full context, perception, and then learning, right? So motor skill acquisition, learning, and perception. How would you define each of those three?
Yeah, so perception is kind of, we kind of have a general use we use in everyday language. What we're really talking about is what information do I pick up from my senses to allow me to do actions, right? How do I know how big my phone is so I can know how wide to get my hand to pick it up? What kind of information am I seeing? Motor control is how do I actually use that to perform my actions? And then learning is how does that change with practice, right? Obviously is, something like hitting a baseball, I get more and more skilled. I pick up different information. I have more skills. So that's kind of the idea, how I perceive, and I use that to control my actions.
And then within those three, I feel like some of them are used interchangeably, especially when you talk about motor skill acquisition or motor skill learning. Are they the same? Are they different? How would you differentiate or discuss those?
Pretty much. Two ones that kind of you hear a lot are motor learning and skill acquisition. I kind of, for most purposes, I think they're the same. Motor learning tends to be sometimes more of a lab basic research term where people are doing kind of abstract tasks like, that aren't, like a sports task, where skill acquisition is more about, learning to hit a ball, learning to ride a bike, things like that. So that would, but they're, for the most part, they're the same. I would consider them.
Okay. And you've done a great job creating a resource for us, the book titled Move. And within that, I thoroughly enjoyed a lot of these topics that we already began to talk about, but you dive deeper into those. So before we kind of go into some of those deeper topics and talk more about your findings in that book and how we can all just be better practitioners, what was the motivation for wanting to write a book?
Yeah, it's kind of spun out of my podcast. So I have a podcast, Perception Action Podcast, where I talk about a lot of this stuff. But there's this kind of change. There's this, I call it a revolution. That's the subtitle of the book, in the way we think about how we become skillful. That's been around for a while, but it's getting more and more popular in the last few years, moving away from the idea that you get skillful through repetition, by doing lots and lots of reps of the same thing, kind of some basic ideas like that. So there's a kind of a different approach. And so I saw this opportunity to I got a lot of people asking me, where should I start if I'm interested? Where can I go to get a basic introduction? So I thought, I didn't have always a great answer. So I thought, I'll just provide one. So I tried to pull all the pieces together and tried my best to explain. There's some kind of difficult concepts in there. So I tried to kind of explain them in my ways of trying to make analogies and things. So that was with the goal of that, to make kind of an entry point into this. Sometimes it's called the ecological approach. Ecological dynamics is another term here.
How I'm very familiar with that phrase, and also in my understudies, we were taught dynamic systems theory. So
Mm-hmm.
really between ecological thinking and dynamic systems thinking,
Mm-hmm.
how are they the same? How are they different?
Yeah, so it's really a marrying of the two. So dynamical systems is describing kind of complex systems, how they kind of focusing on the one of the main principles, self-organization. So how systems come to have order and solve problems without having like a boss or a central controller. That's kind of the dynamical systems, and the other side of it is this ecological psychology idea coming from James Gibson. That's more on the perception side of it, how we pick up information from the environment, how we use it. So it's really kind of marrying these two fields together.
So how important is perception within the realm of motor skill acquisition and learning?
I think it's very, it's very, very important. It's what, it's how we decide what action to perform when, and we see a gap between two players in soccer and we pass the ball, right? Depending on the size of the gap, is the gap closing. So all of our actions are driven by what information we perceive in the environment. We don't always train them that way, but I think it's essential to think of it that way.
So you mentioned having this like revolution around, how we approach learning, how we approach coaching. You mentioned, I can just last year, I remember working in team sports, right? You got basketball players that come after practice and they're putting up, 100 jump shots with no context, no contest, just, hey, we're just going to stand behind the three and launch, 10 from 7 spots, whatever it may be. Whereas you're talking more about, hey, like we want to revolutionize this. So could you touch upon using that as the classic example, like you said, repetition is how we get better versus looking at it more from an ecological perspective? How are we evolving when it comes to coaching and teaching motor skill acquisition?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So kind of the classic way we teach skills is the idea that there's one kind of ideal way to do a skill, right? There's one ideal way to do a jump shot. You go to a coach who will teach you that way, right? So they demo it, they instruct it. When you do it slightly wrong, or you let your elbow drop, keep it up. You repeat it. And so the idea is for that one way to do it to become automatic, or go into, sometimes we talk about motor memory. So you can just pull it out, right? And, the phrase is like perfect practice makes perfect. And, so we were going to repeat that until it's stored in our brain and we can just pull it out. But the kind of revolution is we realize that there's more than one way to do things. And in fact, even within the single player, like I always like Steph Curry as an example. Steph Curry never makes the same jump shot twice. He has lots of different jump shots that he uses. We want athletes that in order to be skillful, you need to adapt to your circumstances, right? You don't make the same jump shot when there's two players in your face versus you're wide open, when you're moving, when you're on the move, when you come off a screen. All these things are going to change how you do a shot. So what we're trying to do is practice it in more game-like conditions, right? So instead of having you, right, so I work with some NBA teams, and the first thing that you see when you go to practice is these guys, like if they're just practicing jump shots, they make 80-90% of 3-pointers. And then in the game, it goes down to 30, right? What's happening? What happened there? It's because you can't just stand there and shoot 10 in a row from the same spot in an NBA game. So in practice, we want to change the term we use are called constraints. Put someone in your face, make you shoot off. So you can develop this kind of, we call it functional variability, this ability to vary how you're doing your shot so that you can be successful in a wide range of conditions.
How would you define variability?
So variability is, what I mean is kind of the difference in the way you shoot from execution to execution. So maybe one time your hand's here or your elbow is bent this much, so what the old view of thinking is, you want repeatability. You want to do things exactly the same way every time. The key to being a good jump shooter is to do exactly the same thing every time. The problem is the constraints or conditions aren't the same every time, right? There's a tall person in your face. You need to do a fadeaway, or you need to coming off a screen to your left, right? So variability is you need to change something about your shot from execution to execution to be successful.
In some earlier models of motor learning. I think it was, please correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it was like
Sure.
Schmidt schema theory. There was this idea that we had these generalized motor programs, and then we would adapt based on maybe some contextual factors. How is that the same or different? How we evolve within the context of having some repetition, but also variability within the constraints of that given moment?
Yeah, so I guess the difference is, we want kind of the athlete to do that right from the start, being able to adapt and adjust and find it themselves, a way that works for them, rather than a coach giving you kind of giving you this main fundamental program and then teaching you the adjustments you need to make. So it's kind of a different way of thinking of it.
So is it as far as maybe comparing, hey, like how much feedback do we want to give versus how much do we want them to figure out on their own?
Yeah, there's definitely that part. There's kind of within this approach, there's a shift in the kind of the role of a coach from an instructor. Here, you come to me, I tell you how to do everything, to a guide. I'm going to help you find a way for you to do it. Right? The other thing we accept is there's the way that you shoot jump shots is going to be slightly different depending on your height, your flexibility, how long your arms are, how big your hands are. All these are factors. So you need to find what works for you. I don't know right from the start what's the best way for you to do it. So I can't just tell you. You have to kind of find it, but I'm going to be your guide along the way.
And kind of now, is it within being a guide, right, from going from instructor to guide, right? Do you have any practical examples of what that might look like?
Yeah. So one of the things, one of the big things is the first thing you notice is you don't step in with instruction as much and far less technical instruction. So we don't want to do as much. Keep your elbow up, keep your knees bent. Though, directing attention to the person's technique. We want to focus on, okay, try to hit the ball there, or focus more on the outcome we want them to generate. So we're kind of, much less instruction, much less talking, much less letting the athlete kind of figure it out. And so the coach, kind of the main way we're going to manipulate and help our athletes is through our practice design, right? What conditions we create. We're going to vary things rather than what we say so much.
Now I'm just going to put myself in a sports coach shoes for a second. Okay. And I just heard you say, hey, Rob, I'm not supposed to talk as much. What am I supposed to do? Right. And I imagine if you've consulted with some of these teams, you probably, you get some of these former players that become coaches. This is what we used to do. This is what I know how to do. But then you're actually, what I'm hearing, what I believe as well is saying less and helping guide them is more impactful. So how do you manage that conversation with that?
It's tough. It requires a little bit of giving up control, right? You giving up this idea that I know everything. I'm the coach. I'm the expert, right? You got to kind of give up a little bit of that control. One of the things I'm coaching now too, my stepson's teams. One of the things I find even more challenging than that is kind of the parents and people on the sideline. You get comments like, when are you going to start coaching? When are you going to work on the fundamentals, right? So they expecting you to do that too. So it is quite a shift, and some people are better at it than others, for sure.
What have you noticed of how, to make that shift? What's been successful in making that shift?
The phrase I like to use is meet coaches where they are. So I kind of depends on where you are. I think if you're kind of very kind of traditional, repetition, low variability drills, I try to, can we add a little bit of this and a little bit of that to practice? Can we add more variability of conditions? Can we try shooting drill? Can we try varying the position on the floor a little bit, varying the angle to get there and things like that? And then I kind of start there and kind of build outwards. So coaches kind of slowly see the benefits of that and experience it themselves. So, and it's a lot of kind of, experimenting with stuff a little bit too, instead of having a strict guidelines.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation the phrase motor memory, and the phrase that came to mind for me was muscle memory, right? You hear that phrase talked about a lot.
That's
okay.
You correct. Yeah.
Could you share your perspective on if there's any validity to the term muscle memory, or if there's a better term we should be using?
I did an episode on this actually a while ago. I don't think in the way that we typically mean it, it doesn't really have a fit. The way we typically mean it is we're going to create something like something in our memory that's going to we're going to be able to do that skill without thinking about it, right? the same way. So it's kind of this, it's almost like a program for it that we developed through lots of repetition, and it's kind of, we don't have to think about it anymore. That doesn't really, there's not really a place for that in kind of the ecological approach so much, because we need to be able to adapt to whatever the conditions are. We can't, for example, we can't swing a golf club the same way when we're tired and when we have our shoulders sore as when everything's good and we're starting around, right? We need to be able to adapt to the conditions. So pulling out this one golf swing from motor memory, muscle memory is not going to be very useful. That's what we kind of argue in the ecological approach.
And then what would be the more modern perspective or way of communicating, hey, like I'm going to do repetitions because I need to build my muscle memory. Whereas you take an ecological approach, how would you explain to someone the difference in why you're going about variability instead?
Yeah. So the one of the kind of the big names in this field of research is Nikolai Bernstein, who's a Russian physiologist. He came up with the phrase repetition without repetition, right? We want to repeat the outcome, keep getting the ball in the basket, but we can't do that by repeating the same movement over and over, right? So, well, that's what we want to do in our practice. We're going to practice having you repeat the outcome, but under different conditions, right? So if we're doing golf, let's hit a straight shot on an uphill lie, on a downhill lie, on a flat lie. So we're varying the conditions so you can learn to repeat the outcome, but by using different movements, having that very functional variability I mentioned earlier.
How much variability and difficulty is needed, right? Because if we're making it I would imagine there's maybe too much variability or too much difficulty, or is that more advantageous, right? Is there a sweet spot for variability within motor skill acquisition?
Absolutely. There's too much is going to be too chaotic and too difficult for someone. They're just going to fail all the time. And too little is not going to kind of challenge them enough. So it depends on kind of their skill level. So kind of lesser skilled athletes, you probably want a little bit less. It also depends on your sport, right? Something like a team sport like football or basketball or soccer, the conditions are always changing and dynamic. So we probably need a lot. Something like training a sprinter where the environment is pretty consistent, you probably need less.
I'm just like going through my mind here, like, things you've seen out on social media of, athletes that are standing on air pads or balancing on Bosu balls or juggling in one hand and shooting the basketball in the other. So like all these external toys, tech, things that we can do. Is there any practicality to it, or is it just for show?
I think, some of it I think is useful, but I would ask, kind of what the purpose of it is and what, a lot of the stuff Steph Curry does, like being able to catch a small ball in your hand is completely different skill than dribbling a basketball. So I don't see why you would, what advantage to be able to do that. So I think it requires, adding, things that block your vision or, there's lots of those kind of constraints that can be useful, but I think you really have to kind of know. The example, the question I always give is, can you tell what sport the person's practicing for when you actually watch them? If you can't tell that, then it's probably not, a lot of it's not very good.
That's a good litmus test.
Yeah.
I definitely think that's very practical. One word I've heard you say numerous times so far is constraints and constraints-led learning, constraints-led approach. I am familiar with how this may be different than, just telling somebody how to do something. We talk about discovery versus instruction. So could you define what a constraint is, and then what is the constraints-led approach?
Yeah, so it comes from, so the constraint is something I add to practice that takes away one of the options you have essentially for performing, and kind of encourages you to explore something else, right? So, a constraint can be, there's three basic types. There's the task constraints, which are the rules, the equipment, the number of players, the size of the field. There's environmental constraints like wind, weather, friction. And then there's the constraints you bring, the individual ones, your strength, your height, things like that. Constraints-led approach is a approach to coaching where, so I have a team that's not, or I have a basketball team and they're not moving the ball enough, say, right? So a simple They're just kind of holding it and dribbling it. And so what I could do is I could play a game and I could say, add a rule that you have to pass 3 times before you shoot. That's a constraint. That one's not the best one, but it works. So, or I could add, if a player's struggling with keeping control of the ball, I could change the ball that they use. I could use a smaller ball. So I'm adding something to kind of try to get them to try a different movement solution, different way of doing their skill by changing something about the practice. That's the basic idea.
Since the release of the book and the introduction to some of these topics within some of the consulting work you're doing, or even just in conversations, are there any particular industries or areas of focus that you've seen this information impact the most?
Yeah, so I've seen it kind of spread across sports into a really, start, I work in baseball as my main sport, and basketball, it gets used a lot, kind of spreading around. Some of the more interesting one is it's starting to become really big in mixed martial arts and things like that, which goes against a lot of the traditional approaches. I guess the most interesting one that I've been involved with most recently is in police training, right? So in police training, we try to give, here's what you do. Like you go here, cover explore the hallway in a diamond formation. So, right. So we try to tell the officers the solution of how to, deal with an active shooter or something like that. If you think about it, there's no way we can predict their environments. They have incredibly chaotic and changing environments. So using this approach to kind of develop adaptability, using the constraints-led approach is people are starting to explore that idea. Also, I've heard people talking about it in terms of general education, lots of other but those are kind of some of the areas I've seen it go into.
And I find some overlap within motor learning, skill acquisition when you talk about, let's just say, outside of the sport, right? A lot of the examples you used so far have been around individual practice or team practice, but how about in the fields of, let's say, performance training, like strength and conditioning, and or, the fields of sports rehabilitation? You have someone coming off of, let's say, an ACL surgery, right? Those are two fields that I think also have some crossovers that beyond just skill acquisition, right? Could you shed some insight into how some of these concepts can apply to either strength and conditioning and or sports rehab?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think within strength and conditioning, I think you can add some of the same ideas of variability, right? So challenging a person doing a squat with a slightly different stance, slightly different position, and kind of challenging the stability. One area you'll see this come in a lot. One tool you see a lot of is kind of water bags, aqua bags. I don't know, where you have essentially a tube or a weight with the water in it instead of lifting a solid weight. What this gives is it kind of challenges your stability, right? Because the water sloshes around while you move, and that kind of fits with this kind of approach where you're gonna have to adjust your movements from trial to trial based on where how the water moves. Encouraging kind of variability and exploration in the weight room, connecting that with the actual skill training. Physiotherapy, I think we're moving away from using the same kind of idea of getting the person to explore after they've, explore what they can do, kind of instead of doing very set, safe exercises, this knee over your toes, this exact way, getting them to explore, getting them more variability in the movement. So it is being applied to those fields as well.
You just mentioned about like, hey, having your knee move in a certain position or your hip move in a certain position. From your perspective, right, there's, and from my experience working in the fields of physical therapy and performance, there's a right way to move and there's a wrong way to move, or there's an ideal posture and there's a not ideal posture, right? From what understanding variability, environment, constraints, is there validity to that statement as far as a right way to move or a perfect posture, or is the body adapting to what the demands are placed on?
Yeah, I think there's a certain validity to it, right? There's certain, definitely ways we can move that will get us injured, can hurt more. So I think we need to take that into account. But I think it's a lot more liberal than we thought. I think we can move in lots of different ways. And we will. The problem that part of I see is, in competition and in games, we get into these positions with our body that we never allow ourselves to in any other time because we worry about getting hurt. Maybe that's why we get hurt, right? We never experience these kind of positions in practice and in PT. But yeah, so I think I don't know if right and wrong, I'd say maybe I'd be too strong, but there are certain kind of, constraints on injury prevention and things like that for sure.
You think it's fair to say there maybe should be a bandwidth of acceptable movement parameters based on the given sport? Like, do you think we're in a space from understanding biomechanics to know what the optimal bandwidth would be? Like, I can imagine in baseball pitching, there's probably some ideal state for pitching. Is there validity in that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's kind of principles. I think in terms of principles, we have to satisfy rather than positions, right? So we don't have to have our arm at 90 degrees. But we have to make sure we don't get our arm too far from our body to kind of put all the force, break the kinetic chain and put too much force in our elbow, something like that. So yeah, I think that I would agree with that.
And from the work that you have done in sports, are there any popular misconceptions or misunderstandings that we've learned in the past but are improving upon when it comes to motor skill and learning?
I think a lot of them are the kind of ones I've addressed, like the role of variability, the repetition. Yeah, I don't know. There's some kind of it's understandings about this approach is like just letting the athlete do whatever they want. It's not, it's about guiding them. So, not that I know of, like the kind of just the main ones I've already talked about. Yeah.
All right. I want to play as like a kind of a hypothetical situation in the world that you have a blank canvas, right? And if you were to design a practice for an individual to improve a particular skill, I think we've been talking about the jump shot. Let's just talk about jump shooting in basketball, right? If you were to design a practice for an individual or maybe set principles for a long-term planning, how would you go about doing it when designing this?
Yeah, so the kind of principal way approach we use is called representative design. So representative design is where there's certain key features that, right, of the practice that we always want there. We can kind of scale it up and down based on how well they're performing in their skill level. So I want the information there, right? So when you shoot a jump shot in basketball, you're doing it with someone trying to defend you, right, all the time, right? So I want some defender there, right? I want something that's going to tell you, am I open? Can I shoot now? How high do I have to shoot to get it over this person? So I want that. The movement itself is going to, so I want some variability in the conditions, right? Where you're shooting from, how far the shot is, how you got the pass. Was it pass low? Was it a nice pass, right? Were you on the move? So adding kind of variation in that. And also kind of, adding some of the kind of the emotional kind of context, like time pressure, game time, those kind of things into practice when we can. So not all have to be there all the time. There, like we said before, that would be too overwhelming in most cases, but kind of scaling that up as the person becomes more skillful.
And then if we were to scale that and we talk about designing a team practice, a team looking to prepare for another opponent, let's talk about an NBA team looking to, NBA season just started recently, looking to prepare for the first game of the season. How would you go about structuring a team practice with some of the perspectives as you brought us here today?
Yeah, so one of the challenges I've seen in working in sports is kind of balancing the skill development part with the game preparation part, right? So skill development, we want kind of people exploring. We want the challenge level difficulty pretty high. We want people making mistakes. Like we don't want them hitting a million shots. Whereas game preparation, you want to kind of build confidence, people feeling good, right? So what I try to do is kind of blend those two. So maybe early in the day, let's start with some things that really challenge you. Shooting, off the dribble, shooting over lots of defenders, or whatever it is. And then as we get more as we get closer to the game, get more specific to the opponent you're going to face. What defense? Let's practice against the defense they're going to play. If they have a really tall defender, let's try to set that up in the middle. And then as we get closer to the game, I realize there's a place for doing the same jump shot from the same spot. Right? It makes you feel good and confident. Right? I don't have any problem with that as long as you recognize that's what I'm trying to do with that, and don't do that all day. Right? Like there's enough time to do the hard. So we're going to break you down, make it difficult, and then build you back up. That you feel good about yourself right before you go in the game.
Where does watching video or team film or individual film, where is the place in that, and how much do you think, when you talk about the balance of everything you just mentioned too, and then you're layering video and film, where does it fit in?
I like to do that fairly early in that process, because what I want to do with that is I want to come out with some specific, intentions or that we're going to try to implement. So we're going to watch the video of the opponent. We're going to say it's really important that we close out on their 3-point shooters. Let's actually practice doing. Let's create a practice environment where we do that. We don't just sit in the video room and say, "Yeah, we'll do that." Let's actually physically do that and set up some practice activity where we have to do that. So I like to do it fairly early in the day, so we have time to implement the approach we're going to use against the specific opponent we're going to face that night.
And then the third hypothetical I was hoping to pick your brain on here was, if you have the return to play process where there is, and let's use a longer term return to play, such as, an ACL or an Achilles rupture, or even in baseball, you have the UCL. When we talk about principles from motor learning and variability and constraints-led approach, is there anything that you think we're missing or we could upgrade within the return to play process that considers these factors?
Yeah, that's always a challenge. I think you really kind of have to, I think you can use the constraints-led approach based on, and then you just really have to monitor the performance and obviously the feedback the person is giving you about any pain or discomfort they're feeling. Maybe, reduced kind of the degrees of freedom and like how many, like, for example, having person throw off their knees or throw, different, how not off a mound, do shorter distance throws, things like that. So to initially kind of get them, back in throwing without possible re-injury, and then kind of scale it up closer to the real thing based on the feedback you're getting.
Perfect. Yeah. With some of the work that you've been doing inside team sports, has there been anything that's surprised you about the environments that make it challenging to implement some of these, or surprisingly, hey, like these are things that are only in these environments or you can get away with, or you can introduce some of this? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Not too much. I think kind of some of the things I expect, there's certainly a lot of kind of repetition and kind of, practice that, I don't think those goals I defined earlier, I don't think we've clearly thought about which one we're trying to do. And, some of the challenges of that, some of the challenges, I think of kind of getting, I think part of the thing I've seen is, I think along with kind of getting coaches to understand it, I don't think players, you kind of have to educate them about, like I give a presentation to all our players, I call it what learning really looks like. They're in their mind, from what they heard, learning is when is being successful every time, right? So hitting the ball hard every time in practice, then that's a good practice for them. That's probably not, and from our view, right? That's that we didn't challenge you enough. If you're doing successful every attempt, you need to kind of change the constraints, challenge you a bit more. So kind of getting that understanding, and then the overall kind of the focus on like players always want to focus on the technical, their technique. You can see their smoke coming out of their ears after. Kind of moving away from that. We know there's tons of research showing that really hinders skill acquisition. Focusing with something called the internal focus of attention. Focus on what your body's doing. We want to move you away from that as much as we can.
You have a new book coming out here. We've been a lot of the ideas he talks about here, I think, kind of cross over to a new book that you're going to be bringing out here called, Learning to be an Ecological Coach. So I'd be curious to see, is there anything else that's in the book that we haven't really even shed some light onto that can help us be better coaches and therapists within our field?
So I'm finishing an offer right now. I'm kind of pushing to get it done. Right now. Yeah, I think it's basically could I coach in a way that is consistent with this theory, and I guess it touches on more kind of how could I create a culture like around our team, some of that. How could I get athletes a sense of motivation and autonomy think so. So some of those kind of things, as well as the nitty gritty of practice design and variability and things like that.
Without giving away too much, would you be keen to share any tips you have from those perspectives or ideas as far as creating culture? Because I believe culture is a huge, huge part of what makes teams successful, including the environment. Do you have anything you could share with us without giving away too much?
Yeah, I think there's a few, like, so the one term I talk a lot is kind of psychological safety, which is kind of creating an environment where it's okay to kind of question things and it's okay to make mistakes. But if you want people to explore and try things and you're going to challenge them at a high level, you can't have an environment where they feel afraid of failing. Like they think there's a scout watching them all the time, or they think you're going to make you run laps if I swing and miss, right? So creating that culture on your team where that's okay, that's what we want. So we, I like I said, that's part of my what learning really looks like presentation. Where these practices are deliberately designed to make you fail sometimes, right? That's what we expect. We don't, if you're doing perfectly every time, that's not what we want. So that getting that kind of culture where that's okay, I think is really important.
I think that'd be incredibly important. Just feeling like you have the opportunity to play in the sandbox without repercussions, right? And no pun, but using the sandbox as having some boundaries of saying, hey, let's not go too far outside, but it's okay to try out and be a little bit creative.
For sure.
If someone was looking to, improve any part of their game, their skill, or start a new hobby, right? We talked a lot about learning and skill acquisition without trying to overload them and say they have to go through all these different things. What would be an appropriate first step that people could take to begin learning a new skill?
I think, I guess it depends on what it is, but trying to, think about creating the practices with, kind of changing the constraints, adding the variability to your practice fairly early. Instead of doing, when you go, you want to learn how to play basketball, instead of practicing the same shot from the same position, adding some variability in the conditions. I think for most sports now, I think it depends on the specific sport, kind of how you want to do it. But there's some good resources out there too if you want to learn kind of the basics of this, for sure.
And when should someone go and seek out a coach or get some help, right? Not getting someone that's going to tell them what to do, but maybe help them out at the same time.
I think it's, I think if you kind of are serious about it, I think fairly early on, right? One thing I think when we train ourselves, sometimes the famous kind of concept is deliberate practice, right? That comes from Anders Ericsson. The idea that you get better when you work on your weaknesses, right? You work on things you need to do. We don't do that so much when we are set to our own devices. There's a lot of research showing that. I do. My example I always give, I'm a runner. So when I would go out, I'm a long distance runner. So when I go out, I should be probably running fast to get my speed or running really slow to recover. But I don't. I always run right in the middle because it's kind of rewarding, right? It's way more rewarding. I can go far within a the same amount of time. It makes me feel good. So I don't think athletes on their own are the best at setting these practice conditions and kind of pushing themselves and challenging themselves. So I think a coach can be really helpful.
And then how would that apply to, say, in the context of rehab or return to play?
I think the same thing. I think you need maybe someone that's going to push you a little bit. Like, obviously you're your best guide. You know what's painful and hurts. But I think, we need someone kind of that can think of different ways to kind of constrain and push it. I think it's very helpful.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And one underlying tone that I love to ask guests that come on here and share with our audience is this concept of small wins, right? Because we're in sports, we often talk about the big win, the result at the end. You talk about the jump shots, getting the ball in the basket. How would you define a small win within the context of everything we talked about here today?
Yeah. So one of the concepts, here's a big term that I'll throw that I try to, again, teach people that know what learning looks like, is this idea of, it's called nonlinear pedagogy. The idea that learning doesn't happen in a nice straight line. You're not going to show up and get better every day. Some days you're going to go no improvements, you might get worse, and then you have a big improvement. So I guess, sticking to the plan and keeping to it, you're going to get overall see these gains. So small wins are, getting you to explore and try different things. When you're first setting a new practice, that's a win. Even if you're not getting the outcomes you want, at least you're trying something new. Eventually we want to see the outcomes you want. So I think it depends on what stage you're at in the process. But I think, we want to see it's not always going to be a nice smooth path.
It is not going to be this straight linear line that goes up.
Yeah.
Hey, Rob, this was awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to teach us, to educate us. I certainly learned a few new things from you, some practical strategies too. Could you briefly talk about the books that you have currently out, and then the books that hopefully will come out soon?
Yeah, so I have 2 books. How We Learn to Move is the first one, which is a basic introduction to this kind of approach. The second one is called Learning to Optimize Movement, which is kind of going beyond the basics to kind of working more with elite athletes, kind of elite levels of skill, building on the first one. And the third one, as you mentioned, is kind of learning to be an ecological coach, which is going to focus on more how do you coach in a method that's consistent with this, from kind of both a research, summarizing research on this, and my experiences in working as a consultant. All of those things and my podcast, you can all perceptionaction.com. That's where all of my stuff is. You can find. Sometimes I do YouTube videos where I review articles in this area and things like that too. That's where you can find everything.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that insight. And again, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Excellent, Rob. That was fantastic.
Awesome. Great.